The Trinity is one of those things that has caused a lot of confusion among Christians and even non-Christians. So there's a sense in which I'm glad that they chose it for us to talk about tonight. If you're new to Ratio Christi, our theme for this entire year has been the existence of God. Every year we have a different major theme in Ratio Christi, and this year has just been looking at arguments for and against the existence of God. Now, there's a whole family of arguments against God that argue that God can't exist because there's something about the idea of God or the concept of God that is incoherent. So there's a whole family of arguments that argue against theism in the sense that they argue that the idea of God is somehow contradictory. There's something wrong with even the idea of God, therefore it can't be true. For example, I had a debate recently with an atheist down in Florida at an atheist conference, and these were some of his arguments against theism. He argued that an immaterial God just couldn't exist because he thought the idea of immaterial existence, just that idea itself, was incoherent. In his debate with me, he argued that it was nonsense to talk about something existing non-physically, because he said, his claim was that being physical was just part of what it means to exist. So the idea of immaterial existence was incoherent. Other such arguments are, for example, people argue against the idea of an infinite God. They say that's incoherent. Infinity itself is incoherent. So the idea of an infinite God doesn't make any sense, therefore it can't be true. Or a common argument in this family of arguments against God is that it's incoherent, even just the concept or the idea of an immaterial being, God, interacting with the physical world. They find that concept to be incoherent. So they conclude that there must not be a God, or theism is false. So the branch of apologetics, there's a specialized branch of apologetics that responds to all of these coherence arguments. And that is, as you can imagine, called the coherence of theism. So you can buy whole books that are just called the coherence of theism. And then Christian apologists, Christian philosophers work on showing how various Christian or theistic ideas are not incoherent. That in fact they are coherent or non-contradictory. So you can search on Google or whatever for coherence of theism and see examples of this branch of apologetics. It's fairly philosophical, so the weeds get pretty deep pretty quickly. And as you can imagine, with coherence of theism, they don't even necessarily have to prove that theism is true. Their more modest goal is just to show that theism isn't incoherent. Okay? Because if it's incoherent, it can't be true. And so they're pushing back against those type of arguments by arguing that there's no contradictions or incoherence in these theistic ideas. Well, some other examples, more specific maybe to our Christian theism, is the idea of Jesus being God and human. That is attacked very often as being incoherent or contradictory. And the idea that we're tackling tonight. It's accused that, or the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity is accused of being contradictory or incoherent. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. I'm going to be arguing that the idea of the Trinity is coherent, that there's no contradictions or incoherence there. So here are some of the things that we're going to talk about. I'm going to explain why some people think it's incoherent. I'm going to explain a little bit about the history of why Christians came to this idea of the Trinity. Why do Christians believe it? Where did the idea come from, and why do Christians believe it's true? And then we're going to conclude by, I'm going to argue that it's not incoherent. Okay? So that's kind of the roadmap for tonight. So first of all, why do some people attack the Trinity as being an incoherent idea? Well, let me give you an example that some people have pointed to and argued from this that it is contradictory. You might be familiar with this creed. This is one of the early Christian creeds that a lot of denominations even still use today, the Athanasian Creed, and I won't read the whole thing, but I'm just going to focus on this underlined portion, which says the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, yet there are not three gods, but one God. So some have read this and found it to be contradictory. They read that and they say, well, this just doesn't make any sense. This is incoherent. It seems like a contradiction. One of the folks who came to this conclusion was none other than our third president, Thomas Jefferson. He called the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity, metaphysical insanity. He didn't hold back his punches. As a strong theist, he said that the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity, is a relapse back into polytheism. In fact, he said that the idea of the Trinity differs from polytheistic paganism only by being more unintelligible. So, always choice words from our third president. Okay, now I want to transition into more of the history of where this idea came from. A lot of people do find it incoherent. A lot of people do find it at least confusing at a minimum. So I think a good question to ask is, where did the idea even come from? Where does this idea of God as Trinity originate? Who came up with this idea? Why did they come up with it? That's what we're going to cover now. So the concept of the Trinity came about as early Christians were wrestling with the incarnation. Okay? That was the primary thing that the early Christians were wrestling with in their theology, was how could Jesus both be God and human at the same time? I should note that the early Christians believed, they came to the conclusion, the early Christians, that the Bible is God's message to humanity. Okay? So they see the Bible, the early Christians and Christians today, they see the Bible as God's explanation of who He is and what He's like. And so they were poring over the Bible to try to understand who God is. And they saw in the Bible, God explaining, if the Bible really is God's revelation to humanity, they tried to understand what the Bible was saying about God. But as we all know, there are some difficult things in the Bible. Difficult things that are said about God. So the early Christians were wrestling with some of these things, and specifically with some verses as they talked about Jesus. So it seems, and you've noticed this if you've read the Bible, the New Testament very much, you've seen that there are some verses that seem to indicate that Jesus is human. He's a man. Human just like we are. But there's other verses in the New Testament that seem to indicate that Jesus is God, is divine. And so quickly, because we're focusing on the Trinity today and not the incarnation, Christians came to the conclusion that He's both God and human. So that was their solution. That's what they think, and that's what Christians today think, that Jesus has always been God, He's always been divine from all eternity past, but then He became human at a particular point in time. He took on humanity, if you will, and therefore He's both God and man, even to this day. He is both God and human. He took on humanity without ceasing to be God. But as they came to this conclusion about Jesus being God and man, that raised another issue among the early Christians. It raised the issue of Jesus' relationship to God the Father. If we're saying that Jesus is God, is He the same as God the Father? or is he somehow distinct from God the Father? They became, convinced that the Bible teaches that Jesus is God, but some verses seem to indicate that Jesus is somehow different from God the Father, even within the same book. For example, I'm using the Gospel of John mostly tonight. So even within the Gospel of John, there seems to be different descriptions of Jesus' relationship to the Father. There are some verses which seem to indicate that he's somehow distinct or different from God the Father. For instance, in John 17, Jesus prays to the Father, which seems to indicate that there's a distinction there, one praying to the other. At one point, even in the Gospel of John, the same book, John 14, Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, seeming to point to some sort of distinction between the Son and the Father. However, there are other verses, again, even staying within John, which seem to indicate that he is the same as God the Father. When the disciples were getting confused and kept asking to see the Father, Jesus told them, "If you've seen me, then you've seen the Father." He even went as far as to say that I and the Father are one. So what do we make of this? What did the early Christians make of this? That both he is the Father in a sense, but then yet he is distinct from the Father. There's even one section in John, the very beginning of the Gospel of John, where the Bible says Jesus is distinct from God and is God in the very same sentence. So take a look at this. This is how the Gospel of John starts out. In the beginning was the Word, and we know John's talking about Jesus because he talks about the Word becoming flesh, becoming human down here. So we know he's talking about Jesus. So he says, in the beginning was the Word, Jesus, and the Word was with God. Jesus was with God. And the Word was God. Jesus was God. So how could he be both with God and is God at the same time? So this is what the early Christians were wrestling with. Is Jesus the same as God the Father, or is he somehow distinct from God the Father? Because the Bible seems to teach both. To summarize then, this seems to be what they were wrestling with. This is the issue then. How does this all fit together? Because the Bible seems to be pretty clear that there's only one God, right? It also seems to say that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. We're not going to dive into that as much, but there's other verses, even in the Gospel of John, we could look at, which also seem to indicate that the Holy Spirit is God as well. So we've got this situation that says that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God, but it also seems to indicate, other verses at least do, that the Father, Son, and Spirit are somehow distinct from each other, yet there's only one God. So how do we make sense of this? How does this all fit together? This is what the early Christians wrestled with. As you can see, this is a difficult conceptual work to try to process this. However, the early Christians didn't give up because, as I said before, they were convinced that the Bible really was revelation from God. And so even if they couldn't figure it all out at first, how this all fit together, they still believed it was true because they were convinced that the Bible was true revelation, really was a message from God, and so they believed it even if they couldn't fully understand it. However, they continued pressing, which is, I think, appropriate to do, pressing into it. Various theories were presented as to how this all fit together, and they discussed it and had various meetings and conferences and discussions about how all this could fit together. And I'm going to zoom through all those for the sake of time and just come and just tell you the conclusion that the early Christians came to on how this all fit together. They concluded with this idea or concept of God as Trinity. So here's what they proposed, and this is what Christians have believed ever since. This is the core idea of the Trinity. That God is one ousia and three hypostases. Now, hypostases is usually translated as person. in English, but the term hypostasis wasn't explicitly defined at first. When at first the term was used, it was, in a sense, at least for some of the early church leaders, early church theologians, it was almost a filler term, just used to note that there is a distinction here. Even if we don't fully understand the distinction, we recognize that there is a distinction between the Father, Son, and Spirit. So God is three persons, or hypostases was the Greek word that was used. However, God is one ousia. Different Greek word, usually is translated as being or nature. So you've probably heard this term before, that God is one being and three persons, or one nature and three persons. Okay? So the idea of being, roughly, the idea of a being is a thing, or a type of thing. When we use this similarly in our language today, we talk about human beings, right? So you are a human being. You're a being, but what type of being are you? Or you're a human being, okay? And so they were trying to communicate that God is one being, or one thing, if you will. But then sometimes ousia is translated as nature. And nature takes a little bit more explanation. If you're not used to philosophical terms, you might use the term nature a little bit more loosely than philosophers do. Sometimes we talk about taking a walk through nature, right? Or sometimes we talk about human nature. And that term, human nature, is actually kind of hitting on this usage of the term nature, okay? So nature, in this context, or when it's used by philosophers, the term nature usually refers to a set of something's essential properties that a thing must have in order to be that type of thing, okay? So if I'm going to say that I am a human, if I have human nature, then I must have everything that's required in order to be that sort of thing, to be human. It's all the essential properties, and we might not even be sure what all the essential human properties are, but you can think of, okay, well, what is essential to being human? And you can have that conversation. There's differences of opinions, right, and disagreements as to what it means to be human. But I use a silly example often of, what if I lost all my fingers? Would I still be human? Well, certainly I would still be human. So having fingers doesn't seem to be an essential property of being human. You can be fingerless and still human, right? So then you just start that thought process of taking things away. Okay, if I lost a leg, would I still be human? Well, sure. So having legs isn't essential to being human. Well, what is essential to being human then? And we could have that discussion later. But you can understand whatever those essential properties are, that's what philosophers call something's nature, right? So in this context, when we talk about God being one nature, if you will, it's those essential properties that are necessary in order to be divine or God. Now we have to be really careful here when we say things like God is one nature and three persons, because we can slip into this idea, especially if we use humans as an example like I just did. So I might have even just caused some confusion that I'll qualify now to back up and make sure that you don't leave with this confusion. Because some people think, okay, well, if we've got three humans over here, Bob, Sue, and Larry, right? If we've got three humans over here, and they're three persons, if you will, and they all have the same nature, right? They all have a human nature. So is that similar to what we're talking about? Three humans that all have the same nature. And we want to say, no, that's not quite exactly what we're getting at here, because in this situation, with three human persons, yes, they all have the same nature, human nature, right? And they're three persons. However, they're three different beings, right? They're three different human beings that all have the nature of being human. And that's not what we're saying about the Trinity. That's not what we're saying about God. We're saying more than that these three have the same nature. We're saying that these three are the same being, okay? They just don't share the same nature. They are the same being. That's why it's important to point out both of these aspects, or translations, if you will. And the translation isn't as important as just the concept, to get the concept. If you forget the words, that's understandable. I have a bad memory and I forget the official terms and words too. But grasping the concept is what's more important, okay? Now, one of the early church leaders, early church theologians, Tertullian, is usually credited as the one who coined some of these key terms. For example, he coined the term Trinity that we use today, okay? All Christians affirm this idea. Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox affirm that God is one being in three persons. But he's the one who coined the term Trinity. And he's also the one who first translated the Greek term hypostasis into Latin as persona. As I said, this term was not really explicitly defined by a lot of early church leaders, and there's some debate as to what early Christians meant by this term persona or person as they used it. But it seems that at least some of them, some would argue many of them, used the term person to mean something that speaks and acts. Okay? So the conclusion or the idea then would be that God is one being, one nature, one being, but is three persons that speak and act. As I said earlier, this very simple phrase, God is one being and three persons, is affirmed by all the major branches of Christianity. So Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox all affirm this idea of God as Trinity, that God is one being and three persons. However, when you start diving down into the nitty-gritty of exactly how that works out, there are some differences and disagreements among Christians. Unsurprisingly so. Not all Christians agree on everything. And that's the case here with the Trinity. Although all Christians affirm God is one being in three persons, there are two, I would say, major groups who disagree on exactly how this plays out, okay, or exactly how this works. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these two groups. And most issues boil down into two groups, right? You've heard probably about Calvinists and Arminians before. In our American political system, we have Democrats and Republicans. There's other options, of course, but those are the two main camps, right? Most issues have two main camps. And when it comes to disagreement about how the Trinity works, or what the Trinity is exactly like, these are the two major camps, classical Trinitarians and social Trinitarians. A great book, if you're interested in this topic, that I'll recommend is called Two Views on the Doctrine of the Trinity. And this is not something that necessarily divides Protestants and Catholics. There are Catholics, or I should say there are some Catholics who are classical Trinitarians, some Catholics that are social Trinitarians. There are some Protestants that are classical and some Protestants that are social. So this doesn't really divide by that denominational split. So this book is great because there's two authors, one Catholic and one Protestant, who argue for classical Trinitarianism, and then two authors who argue for more social Trinitarianism. In this book, they call it relational Trinitarianism, but it's the same ideas. So I'll send this book around if you guys just want to take a look at it, or nowadays take a picture of the cover or write down the cover. But I love debate books like that because you can see within one book, people disagree and make a case for their respective position, and then see the pushback from the other side within one book. You can see it all just in one book. You don't have to read multiple books. It's all there in one. So let me run through and kind of give you the various details from each camp, okay? And I'm painting with a broad brush. If you're familiar with this conversation, or if you're familiar with this debate, a lot of this was new to me when I went to seminary, so you might not have heard about it before. But those of you who are familiar with it, I'm going to be painting with a pretty broad brush, just because we're only going to spend a few minutes on this. And as you can imagine, with most things, it's not as though there's a lot of back and forth. So just like with Republicans and Democrats, there might be a person who agrees with Democrats on some issues, but then agrees with Republicans on other issues, right? So it's not as though, okay, well, if you're in this camp, then you accept everything over here and nothing over there. That's not the case. You want to treat individuals as individuals and not just put them in a label or put them in a category and assume they hold what everybody believes in that particular camp. So in general, I'm going to just paint with a broad brush, and I'll point out some of the extremes. Because whenever you have two positions, right, there's going to be some social Trinitarians and classical Trinitarians who are actually very close to each other. But then there are some on both sides who take some more extreme positions, and they're way off from each other. So those classical and social that are more towards the middle probably have more in common than within each camp the moderate and the extremes have within the camp, if that makes sense, right? So even just think about it in our political system. A moderate Democrat and a moderate Republican might have more in common, actually, than a moderate Republican and an extreme Republican, okay, just for example. All right, so what are some of these differences then between classical and social Trinitarians? Well, broadly, classical Trinitarianism is associated with the West, so Western theologians, Latin theologians, sometimes it's called. And in fact, this position is referred to sometimes as Latin Trinitarianism, okay? And then loosely, not that there aren't any Western thinkers who are social Trinitarians, but for the most part, social Trinitarianism has been usually associated with Eastern theologians, and especially Eastern Orthodox. But some would even argue that these social Trinitarian ideas harken back to some of the early Eastern church fathers, like the Cappadocian church fathers. I'm talking about people like Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa. So some people would say these social Trinitarian ideas come from those early Eastern church theologians, even before Eastern Orthodox. Okay, so another broad brush oversimplification is that classical Trinitarians usually are going to put more of the emphasis on God's oneness. Okay, so if they're going to start out, and I might even recommend not necessarily starting out from one or the other, because God is both. But if you're going to have an emphasis on God's oneness, then you're going to lean more towards classical Trinitarianism. If you're going to emphasize more of God's threeness, of the three persons that God is, then you're going to lean more towards the social Trinitarianism side. But that's a very broad brush. But just so you get familiar with how people talk and discuss these issues. Oftentimes they'll accuse each other, right? Especially those on the extreme. So social Trinitarians sometimes will accuse classical Trinitarians of denying that God is three, right? They will say, you guys don't even really believe in the Trinity because you deny God's threeness. And vice versa. So sometimes you'll have classical Trinitarians, they'll accuse social Trinitarians of denying God's oneness. They'll they'll accuse social Trinitarians of being polytheists, as though they're affirming that there's three gods. When the social Trinitarians are saying, no, we're just saying, we're emphasizing that God is three persons. Okay. Another big difference between the two camps then is classical Trinitarians, they usually will lean towards seeing a wide chasm between God and humanity. So they will usually see God as radically different than humans, vastly different than what human beings are like. Whereas social Trinitarians, and again, there's different nuances even within this camp, but social Trinitarians will point out things like, well, God made humans in His image. You know, humans, He made them male and female. He made them in the image of God. And so there are some similarities between humans and God because God made us in His image. So they will put more emphasis on those similarities, whereas classical Trinitarians will put the emphasis on the differences. Now here's a huge difference, the next one here between classical and social. And this has become kind of the big distinction between the two groups, especially over the last 100 years. This idea, as we've developed in, I guess you would say, our understanding of humanity and our understanding of consciousness and what it is to be, this came about from a lot of our advances in psychology and studying humanity to understand what consciousness is and what we are as humans. And so if you think of that in terms of God, is God one center of consciousness or three? And the classical Trinitarians will firmly say that God is just one or has just one center of consciousness, where the social Trinitarian folks will say there are three centers of consciousness, three subjects, three individuals, if you will. Sometimes this just comes down to semantics, which is unfortunate, but as you know, with a lot of debates, even political debates, it comes down to semantics and people disagreeing as to what term should be used, even sometimes for the same concept, just different terms, and a lot of talking past each other because they're using different terms to mean different things or the same term to mean different things. So it can cause a lot of confusion unless they really do a good job of listening to each other, which we all need to do a better job of. Similarly then, there's a divide here between how many wills God has. So the classical Trinitarians emphasizing God's oneness, they see God as having only one will, whereas social Trinitarians, at least some of them, will say that no, will is more associated with the person, the persons in God. And so then if you have three persons, therefore you have three wills in God. Always, the social Trinitarians would say they're always in agreement, of course, but it's appropriate to talk about three wills in God. I find it interesting, though, and I'm going to give you kind of a lengthy quote here from some classical Trinitarians who are very, very against this idea of three wills in God. Okay, they find that probably, I don't want to put words into their mouth, but they would probably consider that borderline heretical. And so here's a lengthy quote from some classical Trinitarians and their explanation of how God only has one will. But take a look at this. I find this kind of interesting. So classical Trinitarians, Matthew Emerson and Luke Stamps, they wrote that while there is certainly only one divine will, there are three modes of subsistence, or three modes of existence in that one will. The will is identical, there's only one will, but the three persons subsist in it according to their distinct personal modes. Defenders of the classical Reformed doctrine of the covenant of redemption have appealed to this distinction, three modes of subsistence in the one will, have appealed to this distinction between the one will and the three modes of subsistence to demonstrate how there can be an eternal agreement between persons who share the same will. So God's will is singular, but this singularity does not erase the real distinctions that exist between the three modes of subsistence in the one divine will. So this is where I think some people get frustrated with the semantics here. And they say, well, okay, whatever term you use, whether it's will or modes of subsistence, it seems like there's some sort of distinction here such that these three persons can enter into an agreement of sorts. They can agree on something. Everybody would say that it's impossible for the three to disagree. So there's something, whether you call it a will or a mode of subsistence, there's some sort of distinction that allows them to enter agreements. And so maybe the disagreement is a matter of of semantics. I'm not sure, but that's one of the accusations about this conversation. Okay, now on to some more extreme individuals in these various camps. So classical Trinitarians, they would all affirm that God has a nature, and most social Trinitarians would also agree that God has a nature. But there are some, I would call them extreme social Trinitarians, who say that God doesn't have a nature. And you might think, well, that seems very odd. Why would they think that? Well, these sort of folks have come to the conclusion that this philosophical idea of nature comes more from Greek philosophy than it does from the Bible. And we just want to stick, I kind of find it a little funny, their argumentation. So I chuckle when I say it, but they say, we just want to stick with the Bible. We don't want to bring in any philosophical concepts. So we're just going to stick with the Bible, and the Bible doesn't talk about natures, so we don't want to bring in these Greek philosophical ideas. So we don't want to say that God has a nature, because that's not what the Bible says. In fact, these extreme social Trinitarians will say, if you posit that God has a nature, then you're adding a fourth thing in God. You're saying that God is a Father, a Son, a Spirit, and a nature. And so you actually don't have a Trinity. And I find that argumentation rather silly. I'm playing my cards a little early at this point with some of these social Trinitarians. Okay, moving on. Again, if a God doesn't have a nature, you might ask, well, where does his unity come from? Okay? Because a big part of classical Trinitarianism is that God is one being, he has one nature, and that grounds his unity. That's why he's one God. But if he doesn't have a nature, then how is he, in what sense is he one? And you have some social Trinitarians, some extreme ones, I would say, who claim that God's oneness comes from the communion, the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. That's where his oneness comes from. Okay? Some people like that idea, evidently. All right, moving on. Number 8. This would be another extreme situation. The vast majority of classical Trinitarians affirm that yes, there are loving relationships between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But there are some extreme classical Trinitarians who reject that there are any loving relationships in the Trinity. Social Trinitarianism is really well known for affirming and even emphasizing these loving relationships in the Trinity. So I would say only the extreme classical Trinitarians reject this idea. All right, moving on, just a few more real quickly. This idea of eternal progressions, this is probably going to be new to a lot of you folks. This was new to me when I went to seminary. But the idea of eternal progressions is something that classical Trinitarians all affirm, and some social Trinitarians affirm them, and some reject them. Okay, so again, it's only going to be the extreme social Trinitarians that actually reject the eternal progressions. Well, what are the eternal progressions, you might be asking? Well, the idea of eternal progressions here when it comes to the Trinity is that the Father is the sole and supreme cause of all things, including the Son and the Spirit. Okay? So this idea is that the Father is eternally the source of the Son and the Spirit. Not that the Son and the Spirit didn't ever not exist. It's not as though there is a point or a progression of sequence of events where the Son and the Spirit didn't exist and then they were brought into existence. No, they've always existed, but their existence, if you will, their being comes from the Father. They proceed from the Father. Sometimes you'll hear it talked about how the Son is eternally begotten from the Father, and the Spirit eternally proceeds from the Father, or the Father and the Son, depending on That's the big divide between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. So some of the extreme social Trinitarians who are concerned about this idea, they reject eternal progressions because they believe it makes the Father superior. If the Father is the ultimate source of being, if you will, then that somehow makes the Father superior ontologically than the Son and the Spirit, and then that breaks their equality. You've got somehow the Father being superior than the Son and the Spirit. So that's why some extreme social Trinitarians reject the eternal progressions. Interestingly enough, in our evangelical world that most of us are a part of, there are more and more people affirming the eternal progressions. So like Wayne Grudem has recently moved more towards affirming them. John MacArthur has moved more towards affirming them over the last few recent years. Another one, I'm going to forget his name, has started moving and affirming the eternal progressions. So it's becoming, even though I grew up in an evangelicalism that this was never discussed, it's becoming more of a common topic in even the evangelical world. Okay, another big difference then is this is similar to what we talked about before, but about how similar the divine persons are to the human persons. How much similarity is there when we use the term person, for instance? How similar are divine persons to human persons? Can we use those two terms interchangeably? Or, if we're talking about the divine persons, do we mean something radically different by the term person than when we talk about human persons? So classical Trinitarians, they will stand by this idea that no, when the early church theologians, the early church leaders used the term person, they meant something radically different than when we use the term human person today. So today, we often use the term human person to talk about different individuals who have different wills, different centers of consciousness, different personalities. And the classical Trinitarians would say, no, that's not what the early church theologians meant when they used the term person. That's a modern use of the term, and that's not how they used it. We don't want to be anachronistic and read our current use of the word person back into their usage of the word person. But again, social Trinitarians would just reject that whole syntax argument and just say, fine, don't use the word person at all. We're just affirming that there is similarities between God and humans because humans were made in God's image. Okay, I'm trying to be fair to both sides, but you're probably seeing where I fall on some of these issues. This is another big difference and concern that classical Trinitarians have about social Trinitarians. So, everybody agrees that there's some sense in which the Trinity should be played out in our lives. We should all be imaging God. We're made in the image of God. We should resemble Him. We should be like Him in the ways that we can be like Him. So everybody agrees that there is some sense in which we should try to live out Trinitarian ideas. But there are some social Trinitarians that take this way too far. Okay, so this would be like the extreme social Trinitarians, and I'll give you an example of this. They would say things like, all right, these Trinitarian ideas, three equal persons, this is perfect, this is perfection, this is the ideal, this is the exemplar, so we should take that idea, three equal persons, or just persons being equal, and apply that to marriage, church politics, governmental, societal structures, and we should apply this. And so they'll use Trinitarian ideas to argue for democracy or socialism. And they'll use the Trinity to make their case for whatever societal organization that they're arguing for. So for example, they would say, because the Trinity is made up of three equal persons and there's no hierarchy in the Trinity, they're all equal, therefore our churches should be all equal too. There shouldn't be a hierarchy within our church government. So some social Trinitarians will use this to argue against any sort of hierarchy within the church, whether it's bishops and in the Methodist world, or Presbyterians, presbyters, elders in the Presbyterian world, or the Catholic, Roman Catholic hierarchy. They would try to use the idea of the Trinity to argue against any of those sort of hierarchies and argue more of an egalitarian, democratically functioning church where everybody's equals. And they would use the Trinity to argue for that. Some of these extreme social Trinitarians. Here's an example of one. A big theologian from the 20th century, Jurgen Moltmann. And so he uses the social doctrine of the Trinity to argue for socialism, equality in the church, uses it to argue against any sort of monarchy, any sort of centralized notions of government. So here's how he makes his argument, starting with this idea of Trinity and then applying it to all of these human situations. So arguing against any sort of class rule or dictatorial oppression. And you can be against these things. I mean, I'm obviously against dictatorial oppression too, but I probably wouldn't use the Trinity to make my case for that, if that makes sense. And that's why that's why classical Trinitarians call foul here, because again, classical Trinitarians see such a huge divide between what God is like and what humans are like. They just don't think these connections should or even can be made between humans and what God is like. All right, the last one is a little bit of a complicated idea, but it's called eternal functional subordination. Sometimes it's abbreviated as EFS. And for the most part, classical Trinitarians would wholeheartedly reject EFS, whereas some social Trinitarians reject it and some affirm it. Okay? So I would say it's only the maybe extreme social Trinitarians that affirm EFS. I want to be careful using that word extreme, though, because it almost gives it a derogatory sense. But it's just folks that are farther down the continuum, less moderate in the middle, if you will. So what is EFS? Well, EFS simply is the idea that the Son, within the Trinity, the Son submits to the Father even in all eternity past. Submits to the Father's authority, even before the incarnation. So even before the Son became human, everybody agrees he submitted to the Father when he took on humanity and lived as a human on earth. But the question is, did he submit to the Father's authority before he became human? And some of these social Trinitarians would say yes. They would affirm that the Son has always been submissive to the Father's authority. And they don't see that as a problem or have an issue with that. Whereas the classical Trinitarians would call foul here. And they would say, no, that can't be the case, because part of what it means to be God, part of what it means to be divine, is to have ultimate authority. That's just part of what it means. It's like one of God's essential properties. That's part of his nature, is to have ultimate authority. And so if the Son doesn't have the same authority as the Father, if the Son has lesser than ultimate authority, then he's not fully God. And so the classical Trinitarians will actually accuse those who affirm EFS as rejecting the Son's divinity. They would say, your position entails that Jesus really isn't God because he doesn't have supreme authority. So almost the flip of the eternal progressions, whereas these folks see this as rejecting or entailing the rejection of the Son and the Spirit's divinity. These guys see this as rejecting the Son and the Spirit's divinity. Because if you've got a person who has less authority, then how could they be as equally God? So that's kind of the rundown, just very quickly, of these two different groups within. Again, they both affirm that there is one being and three persons, but they disagree on how that plays out. I'll disclose some more of my cards. You probably picked up on some of my positions as I walked through these differences, but I used to say in the past that I leaned more towards one or the other, and I would use the label, hey, I am this, I lean more towards this. But I found myself, when I would do that, people from the other side would, I think, judge me too harshly and associate me with the extremes on my side.Maybe you've run into this yourself. Maybe you're a Republican, but you disagree with maybe some strong Republican ideas. And then when you're maybe in a room with a lot of Democrats, you say that you're a Republican, and they associate you with some of the extreme ideas within Republicanism, right? And you say, well, no, I'm not that type of Republican. And then that just causes a lot of confusion. And so you've just kind of backed off and said, I'm independent or I'm something or other. That's kind of what I've done here. I've just found saying even that I lean towards one side or the other causes then the other side to associate me with the extremes on that side. And so I don't even embrace a label or a category anymore. But I'll be happy to describe what I believe and what I think is true and let people label me however they want to label me. A lot of these things I don't take strong positions on. A lot of these things I find a bit speculative, and I think Christians should show more charity when they come to different conclusions. I mean, everybody agrees God is one being in three persons, right? That's been official Christian dogma or doctrine or understanding for centuries, right? But some of these more nuanced specifics, I think there's just not a lot of data for us to ascertain exactly how the Trinity works. And so some of it is a bit speculative. So some of these I don't even take strong positions on. But I will say, if I had to just kind of point out some of the things that I have come to conclusions on, I would affirm that God has one will. But again, I would see, as those classical Trinitarians explained before, those modes of subsistence almost accomplishes the same sort of thing as there being three wills, that there can be agreement and loving relationships. As if you know me, you know that I affirm strongly and emphasize even the loving relationships in the Trinity. That's a big part of my book that's coming out this fall. I do affirm that God has a nature, right? I don't see that as a fourth thing in God. I just understand nature as just God's essential attributes, His omniscience, His omnipotence, His essential attributes. So it's not like there's a fourth thing in God as I see it. I think His unity comes from His having one nature, being one being. But I think if you read John 17, Jesus also talks about the unity of their fellowship, so the unity of their relationships. So I don't see this as an either or, okay? And then I said I think I would affirm the eternal progressions. Not that I really fully understand what that even means, but that does seem to be the language of the New Testament. So this idea that the Son is eternally begotten from the Father, again, not begotten in the human sense. And this is where the rub always is, right? This is always where the rub is when we talk about God, because we've got to use our language, whether we like it or not. We got to use our language. And what did our language develop from? Well, it developed from our lives. It developed from our things that we had to deal with, rocks and stones and wood and having babies. And so most of our language has come from humanity, and then we take that language and we apply it to God, the divine, and there's always a disconnect there. So even the Bible talks about God having a strong arm. Well, we know that God doesn't have arms, right? God is immaterial. So, but human language is used to describe God just so we can, say something. And so when the Bible talks about the Son being begotten from the Father, certainly it's not talking about in the human sense where a father and a mother have a son together, have a child together, But I think there is something to the idea that the Son is eternally begotten from the Father in an analogous sense. And this is the key term that theologians would say, the language that we use about God, like God has an arm, or God has a strong arm, or the Son is begotten from the Father. We're using those phrases and those human terms in an analogous way, not a one-to-one way, but more like an analogy type way. We can still say truths about God with our human language. We just have to recognize that we're saying them in an analogous sense, not a one-to-one sense. So in that sense, I would affirm the eternal progressions, even if I don't even fully understand what that all means, because it does seem to be the language that's used in Scripture. Okay, I think we'll move on from there, and I just have 2 slides left as we wrap this up, kind of going back to the coherence question. Let me ask it this way. So, why conclude that the idea of the Trinity is not incoherent? Why conclude that the idea of the Trinity is not contradictory? Because that's what the claim is, right? That's the argument that we're responding to. The argument is that it's a contradiction to say that God is one and God is three. That seems to be contradictory, to say that God is one and three. So we're pushing back against that. We're defending the idea that that's not a contradiction. So let me ask it like this. Is it a contradiction to say my marriage is one and two? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. Right? It would be a contradiction to say that my marriage is one relationship and it's also two relationships, right? That would be a contradiction. It would also be a contradiction to say that my marriage, me and Kristen, my marriage is one human and is also two humans. That would be contradictory, right? But it's not a contradiction to say that my marriage is one relationship and is also two humans. So my point is, and I'm not making a connection here between humans and marriage and God, and I'm not making that connection. I'm just pointing out, and we could do this with lots of other things, I just chose to do it with my marriage. I'm pointing out that something can be one, or something can be in a certain sense one numerical number, and in a different sense a different numerical number. So for instance, my marriage can be one and two at the same time. It can be one relationship and two humans, because it's one in one sense and two in a different sense. And so I don't think it's a contradiction to say that my marriage is one and two. And in fact, it seems that Scripture does use marriage as an example. It seems to me that at the beginning, if the Bible really is from God, and I believe it is, then God created us male and female, and He brought them together to become what? One flesh, right? So I think that is a little bit of Trinitarian imagery there, to becoming one. So we can go through this exact same thing with God, and that's how we'll close tonight. I don't think it's a contradiction to say that God is one and three. It would be a contradiction to say that God is one being and also three beings, right? It would be a contradiction to say that God is one person and also three persons. But it's not a contradiction to say that God is one being and also three beings. So He's one in a different sense than which He is three. In a certain sense, God is one, He's one being, but in a different sense, God is three persons. Now, I'll admit this seems strange to us, but strange is not contradictory, right? Something that's strange might be weird or unlikely or odd, but that doesn't mean it's contradictory. And I think the reason it's strange to us is we're not used to it, right? Something is strange or weird or odd if you're just not used to it. And we're not used to one being that's three persons, right? What are we used to? Well, we're used to one being and one person. So I'm one being. I'm not a divine being. I'm a human being, right? And I'm also one person. I'm Adam, right? So I'm one being and one person. But I could at least fathom the idea that there is such a thing as something that's one being, but yet is three persons, even though we don't experience that, and we usually see a one-to-one togetherness, one being with one person. My wife, Kristen, she's one being, she's a human being, she's also one person, she's Kristen. But similar, if I can use those terms analogously to God, with God we're positing that God is one being, yet three persons. And even though that might be a bit odd to us, because that's not what we're used to, I don't see that as contradictory. So that's kind of how this conversation goes with the Trinity. I know it's been a lot of material, but I would recommend that book if you want to dive down more into the theology and the differences among Christians about how they understand the Trinity. I think it's a great book to get started with. So thanks so much for coming tonight, guys. I appreciate it.